In the world of Kaiserreich, World War I would start out the same. The fairly new country of Germany would prove itself as a mighty power, threatening to become the new leader of Europe. This wouldn't sit well with the other big powers, but instead of going against Germany, some would go for better relations with the Germans. One of the countries siding with the Germans would be Austria-Hungary. So when the Austrians would blame Serbia for the recent assassination of their leader, Germany would decide to side with Austria. In a weak attempt to avoid war, Austria-Hungary would demand many things from Serbia. The demands would basically make them a puppet. So when they would deny, Austria would be forced to declare war on Serbia. Since Germany backed up Austria-Hungary earlier, they would join in on the war. Serbia was backed by Russia, so they would join on the Serbian side. And since France hated Germany and were also allies with Russia, they would join the war as well. Beginning World War I.
Over here!
Montenegro joins in too. Okay, this is simple. The German and Austrian plan is this. Germany will focus on France and will quickly wipe them out. Meanwhile, Austria and some German forces will hold off Russia since it will take Russia some time to get ready. After France falls, Germany will come back and invade Russia with Austria and will win the war. But as soon as the plan is put into action, there's already problems. France is already fortified heavily against their border with Germany. There's no way the Germans could invade through there. So they look up to Belgium, but again, there's a problem. The British have guaranteed Belgium, meaning if Germany invades Belgium, the British would join the war against them. But the Germans have no time to waste, so they invade anyway, bringing the United Kingdom into the war. But here comes the third problem in the plan. Instead of surrendering quickly, the Belgians decide to fight back. And they are pretty good at it. Either way, Germany pushes through them, although it does slow them down. And the last problem that completely breaks the plan is, on the Eastern Front, Russia is ready for war, and way sooner than the Germans thought. The Austrians, unable to hold the Russians off, call for the Germans to come back. With their combined strength, they are able to push the Russians back a little. On the topic of Austria-Hungary, the main military and government officials decided to gather up and have a meeting in Vienna. Together, they all looked at their military performance so far in the war and said, okay, this is a problem. Their performance was terrible and was causing major changes to the plan in the war. Both Germany and Austria knew they couldn't rely on the Austrian army to protect Galicia, let alone the entire front. So the Austrians huddled up together and made their own plan to rebuild their army like the Germans did some years ago. In order to make their army like the Germans, they needed to pull their men on the line back and retrain them with improved generals and equipment. This put heavy pressure on the Germans, but to them and the Austrians, they both knew it would be worth it. But although it would be worth it, the Germans weren't sure if it was possible. But luckily for them, they came up with a brilliant idea. In Switzerland, the communist leader named Lenin was in exile by the Russian government for plotting to rebel against them. So the Kaiser quickly grabbed him up and sent him back into Russia from Sweden, hoping he would be able to cause some internal problems so the Russians could get distracted. Back on the Western Front, Germany would attempt their attack on Paris. They would hit hard, advancing from Belgium into France. They would try their best to flank the Allies, but to their dismay, they would fail in doing so. Although they would advance pretty smoothly, they would be forced to stop because of the Allies trying to flank them back. In the end, they would retreat a little in order to not be flanked by the Allies. And only now did the Germans finally realize their plan was not going to work. So they would try something new. Up north, in the sea, the British had been blockading the Germans from the outside world, stopping many resources from entering the German industries, the main one being food. In order to counter that, the Germans would begin their campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning that they would spread out their submarines and fire upon unsuspecting ships that were blockading. This would be a huge success for the Germans. The only problem was that some ships that would be shot down would be civilian and tourist ships, containing a few number of Americans, but still, they would continue their campaign. Moving down into the Middle East, before the unrestricted submarine campaign, there was another problem for the Allies. The Ottoman Empire was very split on joining the war. One side wanted to join against the Allies, and one wanted to stay neutral. And so, for a good amount of time, they stayed neutral until the popular vote finally became in favor of joining the war. Quickly, the Ottomans would move in to attack. First, they would attempt to invade the Sinai Peninsula, which went great. Then, they attempted to invade Kuwait, which didn't go so well. Then they tried to invade the Caucasus, which went really badly. But even if the Ottomans weren't the best pick to join the Central Powers, they still helped tremendously in distracting the Allies. In order to counteract the Germans after the Ottomans would join the war, the Allies would look for a new contender as well. Italy was a country who was once friendly with the Central Powers, but after some straining of relations with the Austrians, the Italians would agree to join the war on the Allies' side, after the British would promise some Austrian land and money in return. But the Austrians and Germans had planned the Italian invasion for some time now, and had built a strong defense in the mountains, just creating a new stalemate front. After a quick genocide in Turkey, the war seemed to dial down for a month or two, until the Russians would be forced to conduct a massive retreat. They would be forced to retreat because of multiple German Austro pushes, destroying their supply line and threatening encirclements. Down in the Balkans, the Serbian front is a real thorn in the Central Powers' back, wasting a good amount of men and resources on the Serbians. But still, the Austrians' offensives keep on failing, so the Germans look towards Bulgaria. The Bulgarians have had a huge grudge against their neighbors recently, and would love to get some payback. So after being promised southern Serbia, they would join the war against the Allies. Together, the Austrians and Bulgarians would invade Serbia and Montenegro. The Allies' forces would attempt to flee into neutral Albania, which would have no choice but to let them come in. So the Austrians would also come in a quote-unquote friendly invasion. All right, let's quickly cover 3 important topics. Down in colonial Germany, most of their colonies would be taken by the Allies, besides one. German Tanzania would be ordered to fight to the death, making their capture almost impossible. Back to the Ottomans, the British have been slowly creeping up in Iraq through Kuwait. But because of a domino effect of bad communications, the British would find themselves encircled by the Turks. The siege of Kut would last 4 months until the British forces would eventually surrender. And lastly, back to France. The Germans would try their luck on an attack into the enemy. The Battle of Verdun would be a bloodbath, becoming the deadliest battle within the war yet. Both sides would suffer similar casualties, but because of supply draining every day, it affected the Germans more. After Germany would declare war on the Portuguese for some complicated reasons, once again the war would dial down for a month until some more action would occur, but this time, somewhere unexpected. In Ireland, a fairly large group of Irish patriots would step to the streets. Barely aided by the Germans, they would still riot, but instead of the British putting it down quickly, they would be halted by the armed Irish forces. The siege of Dublin would eventually be won by the British within only 4 days, but it would put a good wound in their reputation of the strongest country in the world. Talking about the Brits, they would engage in the largest naval battle in history yet, the British and German Navy suffering catastrophic losses. Meanwhile, the Germans and Austrians would continue their pressure on their 2 Western fronts, constantly making the Western Allies alert, draining their morale slowly. In order to help their friends out, the Russians would try their luck in the attack against the Austrians to distract the Central Powers, relieving some stress off the French and Italians for now. Down in Arabia, the Turks would receive word of a revolt in Mecca. Tens of thousands of rebels would begin to expand and take southern Ottoman territory. With the Battle of the Somme beginning and looking like a possible British push, and also with the Russians continuing their invasion of Anatolia, the Romanians finally thought it was their time to shine. Bruh. In Greece, the British and French had earlier landed troops into the country, preparing for an invasion of Bulgaria since the Greeks would allow them to do so. But instead of joining the war, the Greeks would fight with themselves. One side wanting to join the war on the side of the Allies, one side wanting to join with the Central Powers, and one would want to stay neutral. Eventually, the Greeks would attempt to softly push the Allies out of their country since they had changed their mind. But instead of accepting Greece's neutrality, the Allies would go down and siege Athens, leading to multiple armed confrontations. After a month-long stay, the British and French would leave, but not without deciding to navally blockade the Greeks. After having their economy destroyed because of the blockade, the Greeks would finally submit again and would allow Allied troops to come back. And soon enough, the Greeks would declare war on the Central Powers, only to be pushed by the Bulgarians, who had prepared for a long time. After making the hard decision of not relaunching unrestricted submarine warfare, on the 8th of March 1917, the February Revolution would begin in Russia, finally beginning the collapse of Russia, as Lenin would begin to really scare the Russian Tsar. Meanwhile, the French would attempt an offensive on the stalemated front line. Although it was very well planned, it would end in a disaster. Horribly executed, the French casualties would put a heavy wound in the army's morale for the time being. In Italy, after more than 2 years of stalemate in the mountains, the Battle of Caporetto would end in a major Austrian victory, forcing the Italians to move back behind the river. Back to Russia, the October Revolution would begin. Armed Bolshevik soldiers would rise all over the empire, the main group being in Petrograd, also being where Lenin was ruling. Confrontations would occur everywhere, officially beginning the Russian Civil War. In Ukraine, a combined group of armed Bolsheviks and nationalists would rise up and push the Russians out of Kyiv, simultaneously beginning the Ukrainian War of Independence. Only within a month and a half, the Tsar's throne would collapse. Both the communists and Ukrainians would make incredible gains. Along with other nations declaring independence, the Central Powers would be able to sign a ceasefire with the Russians for now. Although this was the biggest victory for the Central Powers yet, they weren't seeing victories everywhere. The British had slowly but steadily pushed the Ottomans on both of their fronts. Modern-day Iraq would fully be taken. Meanwhile, Jerusalem would fall to the joint British and Arab push. Also, another problem had been brewing up for years now: food shortages. In January, strikes would spread from Austria-Hungary into Germany, many wanting the war to end so the British would stop their blockade. In turn, would allow Germany to access the food they needed once again. But still, the Central Powers wouldn't budge. Operation Faustschlag would go amazingly. The operation would be to invade Russia and puppet multiple new countries. The Bolsheviks would be forced to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Although multiple third parties would get involved in trying to help out the Russians, such as the British and the Japanese, Lenin would simply overwhelm the country. Many ordinary people in Russia hated the Tsar till they would join in on the revolution. One of the countries who wouldn't support Russia, however, would be the United States. America so far in the war had been neutral. The Germans would not relaunch their submarine campaign, which would regularly kill Americans. Plus, the Germans would consider sending a telegram to Mexico about invading the US, but they would find it being too risky to do it. So in the end, the Americans would decide they didn't have to join in the war. Instead, they would go ahead and do their own thing. They would intervene in Nicaraguan and Cuban politics, and would also completely invade the Dominican Republic because why not? Going back to Europe, the Treaty of Bucharest would finally be signed by Romania, basically making them a puppet to the Central Powers. But hey, at least they got some land in Moldova, right? Since Russia was now practically out of the war, the Germans would be able to spread their troops from that front into their other ones, but mainly, they would send them to Greece. Operation Teutoburg would be a major success. The combined Bulgarian and German forces would break through the Allied line and spearhead towards Athens. The Greek government would surrender shortly after. Although, the British and French soldiers still in Greece wouldn't. The Soviets would begin to break apart as well. In March, the Left SR Rising would commence. Many important figures in the Bolshevik government would oppose to the treaty with Germany. Meanwhile, the Russians would slowly begin to push the communists back. In Moscow, Lenin would be shot by an angry factory worker and would be pronounced dead in the Kremlin 2 days later. Without their main leader, the Bolsheviks would now really begin to struggle. After a failed socialist uprising in Germany and some back and forth between the Ottomans and the British, the war would finally begin to cool off in the east, but would continue in the west. In late January of 1919, the Irish would finally rise up against the British, beginning the Irish War for Independence. Fast forwarding to spring, the Germans would begin their great offensive, hitting hard into the French defense, creating multiple breakthroughs in the line. The Third Battle of the Marne would end in a German victory, allowing the Germans to be so close to Paris that they could now shoot artillery at the city. They would even be able to encircle Belgian and French forces at Dunkirk, although they wouldn't be able to close in on it. In India, a revolt in Punjab would end in a massacre of dozens, possibly even hundreds of Indian protesters. This would cause a countrywide revolt. Reinforcements would be low, so the British would just be forced to declare India as a state of emergency. Back to France, the French generals would try their luck in their own offensive, trying to push the Germans back. But of course, it would end horribly. So bad that the army would mutiny. Soldiers all over the front would strike, along with civilians, to end the war. In Italy, the Austrians would keep extreme pressure on the front, blowing strike after strike when the Italians were off guard. Venice would be captured, and from there, the Austrians would smoothly advance. Even Ethiopia would get involved. They would invade Italian Somalia. The Italians would also experience mutiny like the French. So soon enough, the Italians would sign the Armistice of Venice, but that wouldn't save them. Republican and nationalist rebels would rise up in mainly northern Italy. The military would have to choose between the three sides until the two rebels would unite to fight the main Italian government. Following the footsteps of Italy, the French, Brits, and Belgians would all sign the Armistice of Chantilly, ending the fighting in the West for the next 3 months. Also, the British would be forced to end their blockade of food as part of the armistice, being a ginormous win for the Germans, reinstating their war support back at home. In the Balkans, both the Treaty of Wartholz and the Treaty of Salonika would be signed. The first one would give more than half of Serbia to Bulgaria, and the other half would unite with Montenegro and become an Austrian puppet. The second treaty would make the Greeks give land to the Bulgarians and Ottomans. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks would continue to be pushed back by the Russians. Month by month, a new major city would be captured by the Tsarists, the newest one being Petrograd. Although at first, the two rebel groups thought they could get along with each other to take out the Italian government, in reality they couldn't. The Republicans would split, giving way for even more chaos in northern Italy. 3 months has passed, and most thought fighting would continue again on the Western Front, but instead, it was time. The Treaty of Versailles would be signed by all of the nations on the Western Front besides Italy. Peace would finally be made with the Allies. The Germans would annex the Lux and parts of France and Belgium, also puppeting the Belgian. In Africa, the Germans would gain huge territories, in mainly Central Africa, but also some notable gains elsewhere, such as Madagascar and Morocco. The French would be able to escape the war with little losses of land, but they would also leave the war with negative stability. Only a few months after the treaty, the French Commune would rise up. And long story short, the Commune would have overwhelming support with the French civilians. Making it fairly easy to win the Civil War, even neutral Switzerland would get in on the action. In Russia, the Bolsheviks would fight bravely till the very end. The empire would finally beat the revolution, but still very unstable, and just a sliver of its former self. In Turkey, after a quick war with the Armenians, they would end their war with the Allies, ending in a white peace. In Italy, after a complicated mess of everyone hating each other, they would kind of be able to rest with these new borders. One Italian nation, if not the most noticeable, would be the socialist government. Socialism has been a big part of the world recently. Revolutions would occur in 3 major nations by now, and it wouldn't stop there. In Argentina, Patagonia would secede from the Republic, proclaiming themselves as a new socialist nation. And again, to make a long story short, the British would get overthrown by a socialist party after a bloody civil war. Their empire would collapse, and the world would severely be affected. In Brazil, their beloved leader would be shot and assassinated, leading to a long and bloodshed civil war, with a socialist government trying their best to get on top. After Austria would get broken up like everybody expected, the world would cool down. Until fast forward like a decade, the motherfucking United States of America would have their own civil war to become socialist. But anyway, that was Kaiserreich for you. A world where Germany wins World War I and socialism dominates the world. And now that you know the lore, what are you waiting for? Go ahead and play the mod.